Hi everybody, and welcome to this video which goes through the strengths and weaknesses of trait theories of personality. This is linked to the topic psychology of the individual for stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of both Eysenck and the 5-factor model, or the Big Five. So even though this is the most widely recognized theory, or the one that's used the most often by today's standards, it's not perfect. So we're going to go through its obvious strengths and its weaknesses. So let's start with the strengths of trait theories. So there is evidence, I should say, of twin studies that support the theory that personality is biologically based. So we know from Eysenck's dimensions, he believed that personality is biologically determined. There is evidence of that, where certain studies have been shown in the case of identical or fraternal twins that they typically have very, very similar personalities. So they will have very similar personality traits. So it does support that there is the possibility that personality may be biologically determined, or a significant amount of it or percentage of it is biologically based. So there is evidence now with more emerging research that that may be the case, which supports Eysenck's dimensions, which is good. It's seen as a strength, all right? So it means that we can make more conclusions regarding the trait theory and it being biologically determined, which links to the biopsychosocial model. We know, obviously, that personality is also influenced by social factors and psychological factors, but again, there's more empirical evidence to suggest that it is biologically based, or at least a significant percentage of it is, and the trait theory supports that. It can be applied cross-culturally in some instances. So, like I said to you in my previous video, especially the Big Five, what's fantastic about that theory is that it is applied to several cultures. It's not biased to one particular culture like psychodynamic and especially humanistic. So we know that humanistic is very, very biased towards westernized countries, and the research is based on a very small demographic. Whereas this theory can be applied to a wide variety of demographics, so first and third world countries, different ages, obviously different genders, different identities, and it can still apply and be as inclusive as possible, which is fantastic. It can be very useful in identifying personality and therefore predicting future behavior. So if we can identify and describe personality, it makes it far easier as psychologists and psychology students to predict future behavior. So if someone, for example, shows high levels of extroversion on Eysenck's model, or even in the Big Five superfactors, it's then going to make it far more easy or far more predictable as to how they would act in a certain situation because of their obvious high score of extroversion, as an example. And this is critical in psychology and being able to analyze behavior and personality, of course. However, there are some weaknesses of trait theories. Again, it's not perfect. Now, personality can and does change over time. Yes, it takes several years for this to happen, but this theory doesn't really explain that. So even though it does take a long time for personalities to change, they do change and they can change, and there's evidence of that. The problem with this theory is that, going back up here, because it theorizes that personality is biologically determined, it doesn't explain then how does it change over time. So there's some factors that are obviously influenced by the social and the psychological, and this doesn't explain that. So some factors may reduce or increase as we get older. So a person may become more neurotic as they get older, or they become less extroverted as they get older. And this theory doesn't really explain that, because it claims that we are born with a predominant superfactor, or we're born with a higher score in one or more of the dimensions. It is also quite broad. So there's only 3 personality dimensions and only 5 superfactors. Now, human beings are very complex individuals, and personality is a complex concept, as we know. So it's often just seen as too broad or too general to explain the complexity of individuals. So just saying someone scores high on extroversion or low on neuroticism, it doesn't really go into too much depth regarding them as an individual. It just really focuses on the surface traits of who they are as a person. So yes, we may be able to predict their personality and predict their behavior later on, but it doesn't really explain in depth who they are and the concept of their personality based on their experiences. It only provides, again, a summary of traits without an explanation as to how they developed. So why did a person become neurotic? Why did a person become extroverted? That's where we obviously rely on the biopsychosocial model. We know that personality is psychologically determined and it fits into the psychology of that model. And we also know, or there's emerging evidence, that there is a biological component, like I said before, but what actually causes an individual to be more or less neurotic or more or less psychotic, that is a wide variety of variables that will contribute to that. Now, we go more into that in our next topic, which is psychological health and well-being. But there could be numerous factors as to why a person became dominant in one superfactor or why they scored on the dimensions themselves. Okay, so all this does is provide the what, which again is useful, but it doesn't explain the why, and that's an issue. It is also very subjective, all right? It depends on the perspective of who is describing and predicting. Now, at the time of filming this, we haven't done this yet, but you would have analyzed me in class, all right? So you might be watching this later on and remember doing that. So your perspective of somebody, in the example we used in class, me, that's very different to someone else in my life who may completely disagree with what you say. So it's subjective, or it depends, in other words, on whose perspective it's from. So some people may see an individual as very conscientious, yet at work that's the case, but at home they're not conscientious at all, all right? Or their levels of conscientiousness are very, very, or decrease quite a lot. So it really does depend on the social context of where you are as to what your dominant superfactor might be, and that's an issue. Because this theory claims that we have one dominant superfactor most of the time, but it doesn't account for the social situation. All right, and that links into the last dot point of this, so it's too fixed. There are many superfactors or dimensions that may change depending on the social context. So again, a person may be very conscientious at work, but very extroverted when they're with their friends, or they may be very agreeable when they're with their parents, but very neurotic when they're with their friends. So which one is actually more dominant and explains and predicts their behavior more than the other? And that's a really big issue with this model as well. Again, more recent research has determined that we all belong somewhere on especially the 5-factor model, we belong somewhere on the openness scale, conscientiousness scale, extroversion scale, and so on. But again, we usually have, according to Costa and McRae, one dominant one. But again, that changes very much on the social context, which means that it's not enduring. So there's a lot of variables that can go into changing someone's superfactor on a day-to-day basis. And this theory does not explain why that is. All right, guys, so I hope you found that useful. As always, if you've got any questions, let me know.